Bonjour et bonjour.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us here. Welcome to this new session for the Rencontre économique des entitled What about Latin America? Will it be a political turn or an economic upheaval? A lot of countries in Latin America have made a right-wing shift. Venezuela, for instance, was very present in the news. This turn is in line in a context of regional crisis for many years, and that gives rise to a return to libertarianism and a closer link with the U.S. We have a lot of political instability in Latin America, and they're still trying to find a place in globalization. This will translate into a genuine shift. The aim is to stabilize the economy. The panelists will answer to these questions. Next to me, I would like to introduce you to Alberto Salbertoni, previous Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay. Welcome. And then we have next to him Andrés Malamud from the University of Lisbon, and Héctor Cárdenas Suárez from COMEXI, the Mexican Committee of Foreign Affairs and professor at the University of Berkeley. Welcome to everyone. So we open the session, and it's up to the economist Natasha Valla to take the floor. I'm going to give you the floor so that you can give us set the scene, so you can set the scene of this discussion. Thank you for this introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce this session on Latin America. And when we look at economic literature, it is a heterogeneous continent, so it's difficult to have to talk about common points on this continent. What we can say is something that we find when we talk about the relationship, when we look at the reports from international organizations, we don't find the fragility that we had in the 80s. It's not a succession of crises that are beyond control, but rather we have the construction of a resistance, a macroeconomic resistance in a way. We have a performance of growth which is weaker than we can find in a normal, in a run-of-the-mill economy. And this is why the IMF has said on the previous evaluation that there's a policy framework that is quite robust, but growth is still weak. So it's a region where growth is expected to be set at 2.5%, which is below what we see in Asia. And so it's not enough. And yet we saw a stabilization of the general framework. We have seen some nuances, but all in all, it is much more stable than it was. And in terms of foreign policy, we see something that is better controlled. Of course, against this geopolitical backdrop, the region needs to reposition itself. The evolution, especially towards the U.S. in terms of balance of trade, well, this has implications that are very strong for countries which are the neighbors of the U.S. and that are very close, like Mexico. But there are other countries also that are very raw materials rich, and they need to reposition themselves towards the U.S., towards China, and also towards other commercial partners, especially Europe, because we talked about the Mercosur agreement, especially in the region where it wasn't so easy to make it acceptable. So if I were to sum up in 2 points what is at stake here, I would talk about one issue in particular, namely the public reform. The public reform in terms of transformation of government and government agencies. We're going to talk about the reform of criminal justice, of the tax department, of the judiciary. We're going to talk about budget sustainability. We have in Argentina some methods that may be radical to develop a budget regime that would be viable, but also to have a fair taxation system. And this is something that we're going to address. And then there are more strategic issues on the international realm. We have seen on the continent the theories of the multi-alignment. Are we going to stick to this bipolarity where we have to choose sides between the US and the others? What do middle-sized countries do in this geopolitical backdrop? What choices will be made for investment, for trade, for technology? Do we go? Can we actually have a strategic hedging for this geopolitical situation for Latin America? This prompts us to have a discussion on the assets and the difficulties on the regional logic. What do we do with bilateral agreements? Should we open up to Asia? Should we forge partnerships with Europe? So this is why I think it's interesting to set the scene and to have a political debate on the right-wing shift that we have in Latin America and the reshaping of the geopolitical situation whereby Latin America is in a completely new situation towards its situation towards the world. Thank you, Natasha. Undoubtedly, this is a very interesting time where we have to face a lot of challenges. We'll start with Nicolas Albertoni. Nicolas, you're starting from a state of play which is quite striking. You're saying that Latin America has a lot of agreements. There's a lot of international organizations. However, it is one of those where trade is not very developed. I'm giving you the floor. Thank you, Rachel.
First of all, I'm really happy to be here. And I would like to say thank you to have a panel on Latin America led by people, living in the region, sometimes suffering the consequences of the politics in the region. So this is a good signal of this program. So I'm happy to be here talking about the region where I came from. So, and the reason about that is because we are talking about a region that is so complementary with Europe that sometimes it's difficult to understand why, from the European side, we don't see much focus on trying to understand what is going on in Latin America. Just to put some ideas, and answering your question, Latin America nowadays is the only region with no interstate conflict in the world. In this context of wars, conflicts, of course, we have so many challenges on security, narco-traffic, and you can name it. But nowadays, Latin America is the only region with no interstate conflict in the world. And the South Atlantic is the only sub-oceanic region, let's say, with no conflict, openly happening. So in a context of global value chains and many things that we will talk about, this information is very important. It's not irrelevant to be considered. Also, 60% of renewable energy in the mixed, energy system in the region. So this is another number, at least, to be considered from the European side that we know very well that is interested in green energy. And 50% of diversity in the world, biodiversity in the world. And 14%, I'm sorry for so many data and details, but to show how relevant is the region, 14% of global production of food. So here in Latin America, Europe has a strong partner to think about in the future. Very complementary, and when I talk about complementarity, I'm not just talking about trade, but also politically and in terms of cooperation. So that said, Latin America, as you mentioned, now has this sort of dichotomy, because I normally talk about the hyperinflation of integration in the region. The last number I saw is 33 regional projects, Mercosur, ALADI. If you put all together, there are 33 regional initiatives Of course, many of them are more related with trade, more economics, and some of them political, but we have 33 regional blocks. So it's not a problem of institutions. The problems we have is on the outcomes of these regional initiatives. And we have at least two outcomes to show that we are not going in the right way. The first one is that we are the region with less intra-trade with ourselves. If we compare with Europe, that is above 60% of intra-trade, and Africa above 20%, Latin America is 14%, and we'll talk in that percentage. And also in terms of investments, 12% of Latin American investments stayed in Latin America, 12%. If we compare this number with the rest of the world, it's more dynamic, the type of investment you have in your own region. So this is the main risk we have right now, because in a context of global value chains, interconnectivity, we have a region that has a lot of institutions of many decades ago, some of them beginning in the 60s as ALADI, the Latin American Integration Association, but they are not having the right outcome to see how we can be interconnected in this global economy. So this is, I would say, this is the main problem. That's why I'm happy you start with that idea, because we are now conflicting. In all the panels we have in the region about regional integration, this is the main focus. We can talk more about how to solve that. If there is one thing we can start talking about to solve this problem is the regulation, the diversity of regulation. And Natasha just mentioned the diversity of countries and cultures, and more generally in economics. In integration, we have each project has its own regulation. So imagine Europe, you know, that has some complexity in terms of regulation. What happened in Latin America when we have more than 30 of these regional initiatives, and many of them are overlapping of regulation between themselves. Last 2 points, and then we can go more in depth in some of these points. Another reason why this region is important to Europe is because we are increasing, you know, and growing the bi-regional relations. We just concluded the Mercosur-EU agreement, 700 million people involved in this agreement, 33 countries. And also, Europe already concluded an agreement with Mexico, the modernization, indeed, of the agreement with Mexico. So something is happening, luckily, you know, in these regional relations between the two regions. So, again, now we have the context, we have, you know, what's the problem, and maybe we can go more in depth on how we can solve the problems we have ahead.
Merci.
Thank you very much. The region was able to have agreements in the different countries. You've just said that there's a lot of countries, so it's difficult sometimes to make sure that these agreements are efficient. And you were a Minister of Foreign Affairs. I don't know if you can talk about the issues, the main issues that you had to tackle, even if you have already said a few and given us an idea. Based on your experience, what should we do to have a better interaction?
This interaction with Europe, this increasing interaction with Europe in terms of trade, also in politics and cooperation, I think is helping a lot to Latin America. I've been, you know, in the front line experiencing, you know, what happened with Mercosur-EU conclusion of the agreement. And to say the truth, was one of the, if we may say, the positive outcomes of what's going on with Trump. Because the main reason that we concluded an agreement between the EU and Mercosur after 25 years was Donald Trump. Because we know that was in December 2024. Trump was elected in November and would take office in January of 2026. So we know very well, in 2025, sorry, we know very well that for two regions with so many complementarities, that was a political signal to the rest of the world. That said, I think this is part of the things that we are working to have good conclusions or good products to show to Latin America itself, that we can conclude things, you know, with Mercosur, with the European Union, internally. Now we are, as Mercosur, for example, considering an agreement with Japan. So things are happening in the region. So this is part of, I think, the good signals we see in this context. But the main problem we have is that we are a very political region. Everything is related, and this is why political scientists are so important in Latin America to understand, you know, the dynamics between each country, because all these agreements, that many of them has trade or economic in its original names, after the years, you know, after they were funded, you know, they switched to a political dynamic. Mercosur is a custom union. Or indeed, in the name, is a common market. Imagine how far we are. But right now, we are more a political, you know, bloc for many years rather than an economic bloc. So how much we invest in the political debates, that again is not bad if you have at least one bloc that focuses on that, but having 30 blocks, many of them talking at the same time about political issues, of course, this is sometimes wasted of time in terms of integration. So I could mention many others in terms of regulation and be more specific in terms of rule of origins and many of them, but if there is something we can start, is that at least to respect the name of the agreements. And you know, that we really need to put focus more in economics rather than in politics, you know, in the integration. And we can have other blocks, at CELAC, for example. There is a bloc that many of almost all the countries of Latin America are in CELAC. Okay, we can put focus there on politics. But not in many other agreements, you know, as I mentioned, Pacific Alliance, Mercosur, politics were more, you know, the time that you invest in politics sometimes is not related, you know, what we need as a conclusion of these agreements.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Nicolas. So let's go back to this we'll go back to Mercosur afterwards. Now I would like to give the floor to Andrés Malamud. Welcome. The Latin American region is vast. There's a lot of countries, and you're putting a focus on the importance of geography in the economy. Does it raise an issue? Is geography a problem or rather an upside?
Thank you, Raquel. It's a key question, geography, because the Americas are a continent with a vertical axis, contrary to Eurasia, in which the axis of the continent is horizontal. But let me walk you through the 4 dimensions of power to understand how this works in Latin America. Power is the capacity of someone to make someone else do something that he would otherwise not do. So let's think of the 4 dimensions of power. The stick, geopolitics, this is very much geographical. The carrot, economic. Ideas, persuasion, this is culture. And finally, institutions, rules, and this is politics. Regarding geopolitics, Latin America is the most stable region in the world. You may not believe this, but think of these figures. There are 44 European countries in the UN, in the United Nations Organization, 44. At the foundation of the UN, there were 14. Countries in Europe are being born and dying all the time. Same thing in Africa. 4 countries, 4 independent countries in 1945, 55 independent countries today. In Latin America, there were 20 countries in 1945, and there are 20 countries today. Borders don't move. This is geopolitical stability. This comes against common sense, common wisdom. We think of Latin America as unstable, but geopolitically, it is not. And this is the combination of geography and politics. Now the carrot. It's a homogeneously underdeveloped continent. There is not a single country in Latin America that is developed. And think of this, there is not a single country in Western Europe that is underdeveloped. So geography may have something to do, even though economists think of institutions, and they win Nobel Prizes because of saying that institutions are the most important driver of development. This is not true. In Europe, there was a Marshall Plan, and there was NATO as a defense umbrella. In Latin America, there was no Marshall Plan. and no NATO. And it is because geographically, Europe was much more important for the United States than Latin America. So even regarding the economy, geography matters. Third point, third dimension. Culturally, Latin America is one of the most homogeneous regions in the world. Not economically, necessarily, not politically, but culturally. We speak mostly two languages, which are mutually intelligible. We Spanish speakers understand Portuguese, and Brazilian speakers, they understand Portuguese speakers, they understand Spanish. And we share more or less the same colonizing nations in Europe, and more or less the same religion. Think of Europe, centuries of fighting around religion, and so many different languages. Latin America is much more homogeneous. We could say that culturally, there are two regions that are more homogeneous, Latin America and the Arab world. And think of this, they are not the most integrated, on the contrary. So you don't integrate regionally because of cultural homogeneity. What moves integration is commonality of interests. So the carrot, more than the idea. And finally, political fragmentation. Nicolas was speaking about this. Mexico exports to the United States 80%. Mexico's foreign trade, 80% is done with the US. Brazil, 10%. It's not a political decision, it's geography. If you are close to the States, you are part of the economic sphere of influence. If you are far from the United States, you have autonomy and other markets to grow. So what Natasha was saying before is very important. The divisions, the experimentation, I will come back to this, left and right. But north and south is more important than left and right.
Merci beaucoup, Andrés.
Thank you very much, Andres. Even if you work in Portugal, you come from Argentina, because we also talk about politics and the influence it can have, the political change, the influence that political change can have on the economy. What can you say about Javier Milei? Because it's a real question. We've had a right-wing shift.
I will speak of Milei, but let me introduce Argentina first. And Argentina is a part of Latin America. Let's think along the same dimensions as before. Geopolitics first. Latin America is not a very relevant region, and neither was Argentina. What does it mean, relevance? Think of the European Union. The United States are very relevant for Europe. Russia is very relevant for Europe for the bad reasons. China is very relevant for Europe. Africa is very relevant for Europe because of migration issues. Latin America, as one Brazilian ambassador once told me, is the least relevant region in the world for Europe. Is it the same for the United States? More or less. In the last strategic concept, they said the Western Hemisphere, and that means in the past, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, now it is from Greenland to Tierra del Fuego, is the first priority, and then it comes Asia, and then Europe, and fourth, the Middle East, and fifth, Africa. And then they took Maduro, and they went for Iran, so they were lying to us. The Western Hemisphere is not necessarily the first priority of the United States. So Milei believes Argentina can be part of the relevant Latin America that never was. And in this sense, he is very motivated, very strongly motivated about making Argentina, he says, great again. Second, the economic opportunity. And in this sense, Milei goes against the tide, against the trends, against the global opportunities. Latin America, in the past, was linked to Europe in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, it became linked to the United States, whether invaded or protected. Nowadays, 21st century, the most relevant continent in the world is China. Excuse me, China is not a continent, Asia. 60% of the world population live in Asia, and Latin America produces whatever the Asians need, that is proteins, food, and energy, including minerals. And Milei knows this, and he is navigating against this. he chose the United States. Against natural economic connections with the growing post-Western world, he went for the US. So Milei is someone who is betting high on very unlikely options. Third, the question of security, regionalism. Latin America is not very well organized, as Nicolas mentioned, because we don't need to be. Europe is not the norm, is not the trendsetter. Europe is the exception. Regional integration is an exception in the world. In this sense, Latin America is just like Asia or Africa. The sovereign nation state prevails. The thing is that it is at the same time being centrifugated by global forces. The economy is global. Brazil and Argentina sell to China. Mexico sells to the United States. And they don't trade very much with each other. But in security issues, they are very much connected. Trade is global. Crime is regional. So Milei may try to bridge, to go over the rest of the continents to connect directly with the United States, but smuggling and drug trafficking and arms and people are being trafficked in the border. And this is the paradox of peaceful borders. When you have warring borders, when you're afraid that you can be invaded from your neighbor, you take control of the border. Once you pacify the border, you neglect it. And then the smugglers and the drug traffickers take place. And Milei cannot avoid this. He has to pay attention to the region, even if he would like to forget the region. And finally, political experimentation. Milei is probably the most original political experiment in the world in these days. But I would say that there are more than one. Populism is an ancient political experiment, and there is one very big one taking place right now in the United States. So Milei being a populist is not news. Volatility. He founded his party 2 years before taking power. Latin America became very volatile, but not autocratic. Parties change, leaders change, militaries, they don't govern anymore. We have volatile democracies, and here the noun is more important than the adjective. Third, libertarianism. This is crazy. This guy goes against the state. He says, the state is a mafia. I'm against the state. I'm the mole who came to destroy the state from within, but still he is the chief of state. The fourth experiment is protectorate in Latin America, not in Argentina, or perhaps it is, Venezuela. Venezuela came from dictatorship to a protectorate of the United States. Milei would very much like this. And finally, autonomy. We can do whatever we like in Latin America because the US is no longer invading, except in the case of Venezuela. We hope it doesn't happen in Mexico. But we can have a Bolsonaro and a Lula, Cristina Kirchner or a Milei, and the US may wrinkle, may snuff, don't like it. But still, we have economic dependency and political autonomy, and Milei is the proof.
Merci beaucoup, Andrés.
Thank you, Andres. So I don't know what you think about that, but we'll go back to the fundamentals of the economy with Héctor Cárdenas. And the World Bank is considering a weaker growth in Latin America, and for quite some time now, the growth is different in Latin America. What are the reasons? Because even if we have had a lot of political change last year, a few years ago, but this problem has the roots, we can find the roots of this problem long ahead of time. So despite the fact that there are agreements and they try to have more international partnerships, but they can't manage to have more efficient results. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Your question is both simple and complicated. If I may rephrase the question, what is the economic mystery of Latin America, because it's not poverty, because we have poverty elsewhere. It's not stability, because we've seen that there's actually quite some stability from a geopolitical point of view. It's not also inequality, because that's a huge problem of Latin America. The real mystery lies somewhere else. How can a region which has so many natural resources, which is quite open to international trade, because we have networks of international agreements for trade purposes between, well, we have Mercosur with the EU, we have an agreement with Mexico, we have Chile that has a network of free trade agreements, which is the broadest worldwide, Mexico as well, Peru, Colombia as well. And it's democratic as in its vast majority. It benefited also from the super cycle of raw materials, the boom of globalization. We have international trade, and we have a redeployment of geopolitics in its value chain. How can we have ultimately such modest, such low results? And it seems that the forecast is actually this. The average rate has only reached 0.9% between 2015 and 2024. Not a lot of regions can say that after 40 years of reform, the growth rate is more slow than the peak of its crisis. And second thing, in 1990, the productivity of work would represent 40% of the OECD countries. Work productivity of Latin America, of course. Today, it only accounts for 33%. In other words, not only have we not caught up on our delay, but we actually even further. Then what about productivity factors? It's a bit an abstract. It measures our capacity to produce more thanks to a better organization, better technologies, better institutions, and more innovation. So this total productivity has remained unchanged for 60 years in Latin America, TFP, and we invest too little.
Investments represent hardly 20% of GDP, whereas it's 35 or 40% in Eastern countries. And for R&D, it's 0.7% of GDP, a maximum. And no economies can converge if they invest so little in their future. But let's be careful. The numbers are not telling the story of Latin America because, let me tell you something, Latin America doesn't really exist. There are at least 5 different types of Latin America with different economic challenges, and geopolitical situations are different, as Nicolas said clearly before. What are these 5 different types of Latin Americas? There's Central America and Caribbean, the best ones, with Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic. Now, these economies have built their growth on services, on logistics, on medical devices, tourism, and sometimes also the digital technologies. And this really shows that you can succeed if institutions and openness and investments move in the same direction and in parallel. At the other end, there are the populist economies, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and to a lesser extent, Bolivia. The problem there is not just that of productivity. Today, the problem is that of the collapse of production, the disappearance of private investments, and the lack or the loss of productivity of belief in institutions. In between, there are open economies, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. Their macroeconomic management is more solid. You wouldn't believe it. because we hear a lot of instability in Colombia and Peru. But in fact, if you look at these economies, regardless of all the political problems that they have, these economies have had a rather strong performance. And at international level, they have a real role to play. Of course, these are small-scale economies. And yet, they rely on commodities. And it's difficult for these economies to move towards productive transformation. And then there's Brazil and the southern pole, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay to a lesser extent. Now, these are large interior markets with an industrial tradition that's rather strong and legitimate ambitions in the case of Brazil. But also, there's a lagging difficulty, which is to be competitive at international level, industrial protection, and gain productivity gains. And then there's Mexico. Mexico is a different economy altogether compared to the other countries in Latin America. This economy is deeply integrated in the North American value chains. This economy is one of the main exporters in manufacturing services of the world. But if you look at their growth rates, it's really very low, and that's surprising. I'll give you an idea of things. If you look at trade, we were saying that trade between Mexico and America is 80% of total exports from Mexico. That 80%, if you look at the total number, it's huge. The US and Mexico together, they trade more or less $1 trillion annually. It's an incredible number. That's the trade relation which is the biggest on earth between two countries. And Mexico today, since last year, has become the first supplier to the United States, but also their first client. Even more than China and more than Canada, and probably more than in the EU. It is paradoxical, and this is perhaps the greatest paradox, because it's really well integrated in globalization. They're a global player, but it's difficult for them to have productive and lasting gains. Mark my words, there are two types of Mexico. There's the northern part of Mexico, and their results are really good, and the southern part of Mexico, where there are problems similar to the ones we saw in Italy, that is the divide between the north of Italy and the south of Italy. And this perhaps is an explanation to the difficulty they have in integrating the regional value chain. As Nicolas and Andres were saying, they were talking about this. Mercosur, for instance, focused on national sovereignty rather than institutional integration for a long period of time. And that's incredible. What we're seeing is that the Mercosur countries were trading between themselves, and there was more trade 20 years ago than now. So trading has gone down within Mercosur countries. And the other integration projects, the large-scale projects, only for Latin America, have almost all bumped into the same obstacles. They rely more on political convergence between the presidents and the governments than rules that are solid enough to have a real democracy. There are agreements, of course, that exist in Latin America that functioned well. The Pacific Alliance, which puts together Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Panama, and Chile as well. This really worked well until all of a sudden there were political quarrels between Peru and Mexico. But before that, it was working really well. And it's still working. If you look at trade between the private sector in these countries, it really works well. I think, and by the way, I agree, the links with Europe, this relation is essential with Europe. But it's a relation that was not a priority, neither for Latin America nor for Europe. Why is it essential today? Because, well, there are two major agreements with Mexico. As we said, the agreement with Mexico, we mentioned that. But this agreement with Mexico is a modernized global agreement plus a trade interim agreement, and that's the second generation. There was another agreement that was negotiated more than 20 years ago, and that's a renewal and a revamping of the agreement, which is like a big bet taken by Europe. That is, to find a partner in Mexico who could help European corporates so that they would join the integrated value chains in North America. That's what's in the agreement. It's quite different from the Mercosur agreement, or the agreement with the Mercosur, rather. This is a totally different strategy altogether. And then there's a promise, an incredible promise in that for Europe. That means diversification of partners. It means more secured strategic supplies. Europe can't just rely on China and the US, and not, of course, on Putin's Russia, and strengthen the links with a region which is a democratic region, which is a Western type of region in many ways, which is not aligned in a mechanical fashion. That's really good for Europe and for Latin America. That means they can attract long-term investments. They can go up the value chain. They have green value chains. They can modernize the infrastructure, services, and production. But let's be clear about it. These agreements, as such, will not necessarily lead to development. A treaty will not create productivity per se. So what should we do? We need to transform this into interior productive capacity. And this is something that Latin America has not succeeded in doing. If we have time, we can look at the reasons why. But it's a complex story. And I think that at present there's an opportunity, but it's, how can I say, it's a very narrow window that's open. If you look at Latin American economies, the five I mentioned before, or the three that are the most competitive, that is Mexico, the Southern Pole, and the Andean economies. But it's a narrow window that's open. I hope it'll work well. It'll succeed. So what do we need to do to seize this opportunity or not to miss it? What should we do? Well, if we want to miss the opportunity, let's do more of the same, what we've been doing over the past 60 years. You're sure you're going to miss the opportunity if you don't have a deep reform of the state, if you don't have a deep reform of the judicial system, and if you don't consolidate a political project which will be stable, which will have a vision. And more importantly, we need to stop this link between the political power and the economic power that's existed in Latin America. That's one of the main problems that these economies have had in Latin America. That is, these economies are really closed. They're looking at their interior markets. There are monopolies, oligopolies that are very powerful, and therefore the smaller companies cannot innovate. And therefore there's no foreign competition in these countries, and therefore you can't really mobilize all the production factors in a more effective way or efficient way. And therefore there's a lot of informal sector, people who work in the streets, people who don't invest. There's no technology, no training, and that's not how economies grow. So we should do the contrary of what I've said. And in the region, according to you, in the long term, and apart from growth, which is the economy that's the most solid? Well, difficult to say. I think that Chile has a very good model. I think they've gone through most of the reforms that they had to go through. They did that a long time ago. And I think this is a strong economy, but it's a small economy. Chile is small. And you have the large economies, Brazil and Mexico. These are the ones that have more options to seize these international changes. But they need to conduct deep reforms. Mexico's not doing this. On the contrary, they retraced their steps. There are setbacks. Look at the main reforms in 2016 and 2014 that were rolled out. They stopped that. They decided to fire all the judges. Now these are elected judges. What about the judicial system? What's the result? Not good. Not good. They decided that, again, they would focus on the large monopolies, public monopolies, with PMX, or the oil company, the CFE, the electricity utility, and they destroyed all types of investments in the energy sector or utility. You can't have a modern 21st century, an AI society without AI, without energy, without having green energy at a low cost. You can't do that. And that's dependable as well. And Brazil as well. Brazil, they oscillate between one policy and the next. They change all the time, and they've not really changed their economic structure. Milei is doing this. Now, there's a deep change with Milei. I don't know if he's going to succeed, though, because governing Argentina is not easy. It's not to be taken for granted. But I think these are the countries that can do something. But look at the smaller countries, Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic. They did a lot of work. And Uruguay as well. They have a very good economy, a very good political system, a state that's functioning. Okay, right. Now, we'll look at the three of you. Now, that's a question I'm going to ask you, which is a bit complex. Now, let's say you have to choose one reform, the most important reform, so as not to miss this narrow window we were talking about, this window of opportunity. Which would be the best reform for you, the most important reform? You can start, or you can start, Nicolas.
So listening our colleagues here and trying to put all together, the conversation we're having. So it's interesting what Andrés said today, that we are so homogeneous as sometimes we don't have the incentives to have a proactive and a creative integration. So this is a good point. I just want to mention that in the context, and I will answer your question, of geopolitics, that maybe was an issue that we have to solve in a context of geopolitics. But in a context of geoeconomics, this is a problem that we have to solve, not having incentives to be integrated. Because, as I mentioned, just to 70% of global trade nowadays is intermediate goods. So the interdependence of the economy is a fact. We have to live with that, and Latin America is not enough integrated to be part of that. In the 90s, just for you to know, there was only 40 regional trade agreements. Nowadays, there are 600 under the WTO. And many people would say, trade agreements are not relevant because of Trump, but believe me, having a trade agreement in this context is much better than not having. If you go to the White House, at least to say you sign that, instead of not signing, and not having an agreement to have as a backup. So the new geography nowadays is not the traditional geography we know. Our mega regional trade agreements, our CPTPP, RCP with China. So this is the new dynamic that we have and the new geography, if we can call that, in that way. So this is why we are transitioning to geopolitics or to geoeconomics. So answering your question, if we have one single thing to do in regional integration in Latin America, it's harmonization of regulation. Just for you to know, sometimes we have problems between one country to another, and we could not, export with one country to another because of the measure of a truck. We imagine how hard it is to live with the same creativity of regulation that Europe has, because you are so creative to regulations, but at the same time, different countries trying to regulate its own regulation, and at the same time, they need to be integrated to be part of the global economy. So, last point, harmonization of regulation, I think is the main things we have to work. It's complex, but there are many things written already on where we can start, where we can begin to do that work. So, again, the context, and this is, I think, the main point that we have to start working in Latin America.
Votre tour, Andrés.
Yeah. Traditional recipes will not do. If we do the same as Europe did, we are not going to develop. We need to leapfrog technological innovation. And let me take it from José María Aznar, former president of government in Spain. He says, Europe already lost this last revolution. Europe was at the head of the Industrial Revolution, and this is why Europe shaped the world. after itself. But now if you take a phone, you will see that most of the apps are American. And there are only a few, half a dozen at the most, that were developed in Europe. If you go to China, all apps are Chinese. Latin America needs to leapfrog Europe, and maybe even the US and China. And this can be done only by working at the technological frontier. Artificial intelligence, data centers, cheap energy, not just clean energy, cheap energy, and pension system. It needs to revolutionize the pension system, which is going to drag down most of the civilizations as we know them. Even in the case of Chile, one of the most successful cases in Latin America, their pension system have collapsed. And so they are going to have trouble in the future. They need to innovate technologically. It's not enough what they have done so far. And so we have to invent a future that does not exist yet.
Hector, vous avez le défi de résumer dans...
Now, Hector, your challenge is to sum this up in 1 minute. I agree with you. We have to do more than what we did before. We need different recipes, as you were saying. We need to leapfrog. I agree. But there was this opportunity. I must insist it's a narrow opportunity window. This opportunity is going towards AI. I completely agree with Andres. But if we want to succeed, we need to make sure that we not only develop cheap energy and green energy, but we also need to have a system, a legal system, which is stable, that we can trust. And we need to make sure that we invest more in R&D. If we don't make these investments, if the countries don't invest much more, and I'm not saying 15% more, 20% more, I think we need to increase threefold. We need to quadruple investments in R&D, not to develop our own AI. This is not going to happen. This is not good, but to develop all the industries around AI, or data centers, or solar energy and non-fossil energies, then yes, we could have a way, a road to real development. But we need to fix our interior social problems and political problems, because if we continue like this, politically speaking, in Latin America, it's going to be difficult. I'm not saying that there aren't any very good investment opportunities. There are some, but globally speaking, it's going to be difficult for Latin America to meet this objective. I hope we can do it and make it, because we put pressure on others. We put pressure on the governments. We say, you need these changes, is what we say. But it's not going to be easy. No, it's not going to be easy. Well, we do hope that, and we'll try. We'll try and succeed. Well, thank you very much. Now we no longer have time. Thank you to the four of you. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to thank the audience for coming.